Sometimes the deepest wounds aren't from battles we've fought, but from truths we never knew existed. For 30 years, Jorund Bearcloak believed he was an orphan, the last survivor of a clan destroyed by raiders. This giant Viking wandered the empty lands of Midgard, carrying the heavy burden of being completely alone in the world. But in an abandoned village called Ravnarskog, inside a forgotten longhouse, Jorund finds an old chest that changes everything. The chest holds letters written by his mother and reveals the name of his real father. Everything he believed about his past was wrong. The family he thought was dead might still be alive. Now Jorund must decide whether to follow this new path or stay with the life he knows. What would you do if you discovered your entire life story was built on a lie? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The northern winds carried memories like ash from a dying fire, and Jorund Bearcloak had been walking into them for more years than most men lived. At 7 feet tall and broad as an oak, he moved through the wilderness with the deliberate grace of someone who had learned that survival meant respecting both the land and your own limitations. His massive war axe, Kinslayer, hung across his back, its handle worn smooth by 3 decades of use. Its blade notched with the marks of countless battles that had defined his solitary existence. The weapon had earned its name not through glory, but through necessity. When you believed yourself the last of your blood, every enemy you faced became a distant cousin in the great web of Nordic kinship. Every man he'd killed had been someone's son, someone's father, someone's hope for the future. The weight of that knowledge had shaped him into something more thoughtful than the typical berserker. Though no less deadly when cornered, Jorund's memories of childhood were fragments wrapped in smoke and screaming. He had been 7 when the raiders came to his village in the pre-dawn darkness, their torches turning the wooden homes into pyres that reached toward the uncaring stars. His mother had pushed him into a grain cellar and whispered words he still heard in his dreams. "Stay hidden, my giant. Stay hidden until the sun comes back." He had obeyed, trembling in the darkness while his world burned above him. When he finally emerged, nothing remained but charred timber and bodies he couldn't bring himself to identify. The raiders had taken everything: livestock, weapons, and any survivors young enough to sell in distant markets. 7-year-old Jorund had wandered the ruins for 3 days before a traveling merchant found him, hollow-eyed and clutching a piece of his mother's burned dress. The merchant, a kind man named Eric Ironhand, had taken him south to the trading ports. But kindness had its limits, and Eric couldn't afford to feed a boy who grew like a weed and ate like a wolf. By his 13th winter, Jorund was on his own again, hiring his growing strength to any jarl who needed extra muscle. His size made him valuable, but his lack of family connections kept him always on the outside of the war bands he served. Those early years had taught him that survival meant adaptation. He learned to read the weather in cloud formations and animal behavior. He mastered the art of finding shelter in landscapes that seemed to offer none. Most importantly, he developed an almost supernatural ability to sense danger before it arrived, a skill that had kept him alive through conflicts that claimed smaller, quicker men. The northern territories where he now wandered were different from the populated fjords of his youth. Here, the old gods still seemed to walk among the pine trees and granite peaks. Villages appeared and disappeared like morning mist, sometimes occupied by descendants of the original settlers, sometimes empty for reasons no one wanted to discuss. The people who lived in these forgotten places spoke in hushed tones about things that moved in the deep, forest and lights that danced in the sky on nights. When no aurora should have been visible, Jorund had grown comfortable with the supernatural elements of his world. After 30 years of walking roads that mapmakers had forgotten, he'd seen enough to know that the line between myth and reality was thinner than most people suspected. He'd shared campfires with spirits who told stories of battles fought before the stones were raised. He'd followed raven flights that led to food when he was starving and to shelter when storms threatened to claim him. His daily routines had become a meditation on solitude. Each morning, he would wake before dawn and spend long minutes listening to the world around him. The songs of birds told him about weather patterns and the presence of other travelers. The rustle of small animals indicated whether larger predators were nearby. The very quality of silence revealed whether he was alone or being watched by eyes that preferred to remain hidden. Breakfast was usually dried fish or preserved meat from his pack, eaten slowly while he studied his surroundings and planned the day's travel. He carried few possessions beyond what he needed to survive: his weapons, basic tools, a change of clothes, and a small pouch of silver coins that represented 30 years of careful saving. Everything else was expendable, because a man who owned too much became a target for those who owned too little. The loneliness had nearly broken him during his 20th year. The weight of having no one to share memories with, no one to care whether he lived or died, had driven him to the edge of a cliff overlooking the northern sea. He'd stood there for hours, listening to the waves crash against the rocks below, wondering if jumping would bring him to whatever afterlife his parents had found. But something had held him back, perhaps the voice of his mother, still whispering in his memory about staying hidden until the sun came back. He'd realized that dying would mean the complete erasure of his family's existence. As long as he lived, some part of them survived in his memories, his mannerisms, the way he approached problems or found humor in difficult situations. That realization had transformed his solitude from a burden into a sacred trust. He became the keeper of his family's memory, carrying their stories even though he had no one to share them with. He would speak their names to the wind and tell ravens about his mother's laugh or his father's skill with woodworking. It wasn't much, but it felt like a form of prayer that honored their lives. The pull northward had been growing stronger for months before he found Ravnarskog. Something in the changing seasons, the quality of light, or perhaps the increasing frequency of his dreams about childhood, had convinced him that answers waited in the forgotten places. He'd followed game trails and ancient paths that seemed to know where they were going, even when he didn't. The landscape itself seemed to be guiding him toward something. Streams flowed in directions that led to mountain passes he hadn't known existed. Rock formations provided shelter exactly when he needed it most. Even the weather seemed to be cooperating, with storms clearing just long enough for him to cover difficult terrain before closing in again behind him. He'd learned to trust these subtle guidance systems during his years of wandering. The natural world possessed its own intelligence, and those who knew how to listen could find themselves led to exactly what they needed, whether they realized they needed it or not. Food appeared when his supplies ran low. Safe paths revealed themselves through dangerous territory. And now, apparently, abandoned villages materialized just when he was beginning to question everything he thought he knew about his past. The morning he first saw Ravnarskog, frost covered the mountain meadow like a blanket of crushed diamonds. The settlement sat in a protected valley between two ridges, its buildings so perfectly preserved that for a moment he thought it might still be inhabited. Smoke should have been rising from the chimneys. Children should have been playing in the common area. Dogs should have been barking at the stranger approaching their territory, but the silence was absolute, broken only by the wind moving through the pine boughs and the distant cry of a raven that seemed to be announcing his arrival to whoever or whatever might be listening. Jorund had found many abandoned places during his travels, but none that felt quite like this. Ravnarskog didn't feel dead. It felt like it was waiting for something. The longhouse at the village's center drew his attention immediately. Its timbers were darkened by age and weather, but the structure remained sound. The carved dragon heads at the roof peaks still snarled their defiance at the sky. The massive doors, bound with iron that showed only the faintest traces of rust, stood slightly ajar as if someone had recently passed through them. Jorund approached slowly, his hand resting on Kinslayer's handle more from habit than from any sense of immediate danger. The silence felt expectant rather than threatening, like the moment before a storyteller begins a tale that everyone knows will change everything. His footsteps on the wooden planks echoed strangely, as if the sound was being absorbed by the walls themselves. Inside the longhouse, time seemed to have stopped. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight that fell through gaps in the roof, but the furniture and household goods remained exactly where their owners had left them. Wooden bowls sat on tables, as if waiting for the next meal. Tools hung from their proper hooks on the walls. Even the fire pit contained logs arranged for burning. Though the ashes beneath them had long since turned to powder, it was then, in that preserved moment of other people's lives, that Jorund saw the chest sitting alone on the raised platform where the Jarl's family would have slept. The ancient wood was carved with runes he couldn't read, and bound with metal that seemed to shift color in the changing light. But what stopped his breath was the seal pressed into the wax that held it closed, a symbol he'd seen before, carved into stones in the oldest burial grounds, always associated with the bloodline of seers and mystics who were said to speak with the gods themselves. Standing before that chest, Jorund felt the first tremor of change that would reshape everything he thought he knew about himself, his family, and his place in the world. The past he'd carried like a stone in his chest was about to crack open, revealing truths that had been waiting 3 decades for him to be ready to receive them. The wax seal cracked under Jorund's careful pressure like ice breaking on a spring river. 3 decades of wondering about his origins, of carrying the weight of being utterly alone in the world, had led to this moment in an abandoned longhouse where dust motes danced like spirits in the fading afternoon light. His massive hands, scarred from countless battles, trembled slightly as he lifted the heavy lid. The scent that rose from within the chest carried him back 30 years in an instant. Lavender and wood smoke, the smell of his mother's hair when she would hold him close during winter storms. For a heartbeat, he was 7 years old again, safe in arms that he'd believed were burned to ash, along with everything else he'd ever loved. The first item his fingers found was a leather pouch, soft with age and tied with a cord he recognized. His mother had worn it around her neck, and he'd played with it as a small child, fascinated by the way the leather had been worked until it felt like silk. Inside the pouch, his fingers closed around something cool and familiar, a silver locket he remembered her wearing. Though she'd never opened it in his presence, with hands that shook despite his efforts to control them, Jorund pried open the delicate clasp. The miniature portrait inside showed a woman's face, beautiful and serene, with eyes that held depths of knowledge and sorrow. Below the portrait, engraved in runes he could barely make out, were words that stopped his breath. Astrid Searborn, beloved of Gunnar, mother of Jorund, taken by treachery, but not by death. The locket fell from his nerveless fingers, striking the wooden floor with a sound like a bell tolling. Not by death. The words echoed in his mind as he stared into the chest, seeing but not comprehending the other items nestled within: rolled parchments, another smaller wooden box, and what appeared to be pieces of jewelry wrapped in faded silk. With movements that felt disconnected from his conscious mind, Jorund lifted out the first scroll. The parchment was fine quality, better than anything a simple village woman should have possessed, and it bore the distinctive marks of someone who had been taught to write by scribes rather than learning the skill through necessity. The ink had faded to brown, but the words were still clear enough to read. "My dearest son," the letter began, and Jorund's vision blurred as he recognized the careful script that had once labeled his childhood belongings and written simple messages on pieces of bark when he was learning his letters. "If you are reading this, then the gods have guided you to the truth I pray you are strong enough to bear." The letter spoke of love that had never died, of a separation forced by circumstances beyond her control, and of a mother's anguish at watching her son from a distance while being unable to reach out to him. She wrote about the night of the raid, But her version of events bore no resemblance to the story Jorund had constructed from fragments of memory and the assumptions of a traumatized child. The attack was not random. "My giant," she wrote, using the pet name that had made him feel special rather than different when other children mocked his unusual size. "It was planned by those who feared your father's bloodline and the prophecies surrounding your birth. I was not killed in the flames. I was taken along with others they deemed valuable. You were hidden not just to save your life, but to hide your existence from those who would use you or destroy you before you came into your power." Jorund's hands were shaking so violently now that he had to set the letter down and brace himself against the chest. The foundation of his entire adult life, the belief that he was alone, that his family was gone, that he was nobody special, was cracking apart like a dam under flood pressure. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to think clearly, to approach this revelation with the same methodical care he used when tracking dangerous prey. The second scroll contained more details, written in a different hand but bearing his mother's signature at the bottom. This letter spoke of his father, a man named Gunnar Sigtesson, whose bloodline traced back to the legendary seers who had advised kings and spoken prophecy for generations. The writer, apparently a trusted friend or relative, explained that Gunnar had been murdered 2 years after Jorund's birth, killed by rivals who feared the growing influence of the seer bloodline. "Your father saw your future in the flames," the letter continued. "He knew that you would grow to be more than mortal men, blessed with size and strength beyond the normal, but also cursed with the burden of supernatural sight. He made arrangements for your protection should anything happen to him and your mother. The merchant who found you was not there by chance. He was guided to that place by those who had been watching and waiting." More scrolls revealed a complex web of relationships and obligations that Jorund had never suspected. His mother had been kept alive but hidden away, used by her captors for her own mystical abilities, while being told that her son was dead. She had spent years planning an escape that would allow her to leave evidence of the truth where Jorund might eventually find it. Should he ever venture into the northern territories where the old bloodline still held power, the wooden box within the chest contained jewelry that bore the marks of nobility, rings and torques and brooches that would have marked their wearers as people of high standing among the clans. But more importantly, it held what appeared to be official documents, land grants and bloodline records that established Jorund's legitimate claim to properties and titles he'd never known existed. One particular document caught his attention, a map drawn on vellum so fine it seemed to glow in the dim light. The map showed locations across the northern territories, each marked with symbols that seemed to indicate the holdings of the seer bloodline. Some locations were marked with simple dots, others with more complex symbols that might indicate sacred sites or places of particular importance. At the very bottom of the chest, wrapped in silk that had once been white but had yellowed with age, Jorund found the most devastating piece of evidence. It was a simple piece of parchment, bearing official seals and signatures, documenting the supposed death of Astrid Zeerborn during a raid on her village. But the document was dated 2 years after the actual attack, and the handwriting was clearly that of someone who had never met the woman they were declaring dead. The forgery was crude enough that any careful examination would have revealed it as false. But who would have thought to question the death certificate of a village woman during a time when such raids were common? The document served its purpose. It officially erased Astrid from the world, making it impossible for anyone to search for her or question what had really happened during that terrible night. Jorund sank to his knees beside the chest, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he'd discovered. For 30 years, he'd carried the weight of being the last of his line, the final ember of a fire that had been extinguished by random violence. Every decision he'd made, every path he'd chosen, every moment of loneliness and despair had been built on a foundation of lies. His mother was alive. Somewhere in the world, the woman who had sung him to sleep and taught him to read and called him her giant was breathing and thinking and perhaps wondering if he would ever learn the truth. The family he'd mourned was not gone. It was hidden, scattered, kept apart by enemies who had used deception rather than death to achieve their goals. The rage that followed this realization was unlike anything Jorund had ever experienced. It started as a cold fire in his chest and spread outward until his entire body shook with the force of it. He'd been robbed of more than his family. He'd been robbed of his identity, his heritage, his rightful place in the world. The enemies who had done this had stolen 30 years of his life. 30 years he could have spent knowing love instead of loneliness, purpose instead of aimless wandering. But beneath the rage was something even more powerful: hope. His mother was alive, and these documents provided clues about where she might be found. The map showed locations he could visit, people who might have information, sacred sites where the remaining members of the seer bloodline might gather. For the first time in 3 decades, Jorund had a destination that mattered more than simple survival. As the sun set outside the longhouse, painting the abandoned village in shades of gold and crimson, Jorund carefully repacked the chest's contents. Tomorrow, he would begin a new kind of journey. Not the aimless wandering of a man with nothing to lose, but the focused quest of someone who had finally learned what he was truly searching for. The past had revealed its secrets, and now it was time to reclaim the future that had been stolen from him. Dawn broke over Ravnarskog with the kind of crystalline clarity that comes after a night of deep change. Jorund had not slept. Instead, he'd spent the dark hours examining every item in the chest, with the methodical attention of a man whose entire understanding of reality had been upended. By the time pale sunlight filtered through the longhouse windows, he'd spread the contents across the wooden table like pieces of a puzzle that would reveal the shape of his true life. The bloodline map commanded his attention above all else. Drawn on vellum so fine it seemed almost translucent, it showed the northern territories in far greater detail than any chart he'd ever seen. Rivers were marked with their seasonal variations. Mountain passes were noted with symbols indicating the best times for travel. Most importantly, scattered across the landscape were dozens of locations marked with the intertwined serpent symbol he now recognized as the sign of the seer bloodline. Some of these locations were familiar to him. Settlements he'd passed through during his wandering years, though he'd never suspected their connection to his heritage. Others were completely unknown. Hidden valleys and isolated peaks that weren't marked on any trader's map. A few bore additional symbols that seemed to indicate special significance: crossed hammers, ravens in flight, stylized trees that might represent sacred groves. The closest marked location lay 3 days' journey to the northeast, in a valley called Ironwood, where his mother's letters suggested distant relatives might still maintain the old traditions. The map showed a path through the mountains that avoided the main trading routes, following deer trails and ancient stone markers that would guide travelers who knew what to look for. Each letter revealed new layers of complexity in the web of relationships that connected the scattered seer families. His mother wrote about cousins and second cousins, about marriages that had been arranged to preserve bloodline purity, about children who had been hidden away when the persecutions began. The picture that emerged was of an entire shadow society, living parallel to the ordinary world of jarls and farmers and traders, maintaining traditions that reached back to the time when gods walked among mortals. One letter, written in his mother's careful script, but bearing a more recent date than the others, contained practical information that made Jorund's heart race with possibility. She described a network of safe houses and trusted allies, people who could be approached with certain phrases or symbols that would identify him as family rather than stranger. More importantly, she provided detailed descriptions of the signs that would mark these allies, specific tattoos, jewelry, or manner of speaking that would allow him to recognize them even if they couldn't openly acknowledge their connection. "Look for the raven's eye," she wrote, carved small and subtle into wooden doorframes or worn as a pendant barely visible beneath clothing. "Listen for old words mixed with new. Those who remember will speak of seeing the pattern or reading the weave when others might simply say they understand something. Trust your instincts, my son. The blood remembers what the mind forgets. Another scroll contained information that transformed his understanding of his own nature, his unusual size, his supernatural awareness of danger, his ability to find his way through trackless wilderness. These weren't simply the results of harsh living and careful observation. They were manifestations of the seer gift, genetic traits that marked him as a true descendant of the bloodline that had once advised kings and interpreted the will of the gods. Your father could see 3 days into the future when the conditions were right, his mother had written. Your grandfather could speak with the spirits of the recently dead. Each generation manifests the gift differently, but it always manifests. Watch for signs in yourself, moments of knowing without learning, dreams that feel more real than waking, animals that behave strangely in your presence. These are not coincidences. The practical preparations for his journey took on new meaning in light of these revelations. Instead of simply packing for another aimless wandering, he was preparing for a quest that might reconnect him with family he'd never known existed. Every item he chose to carry could be the difference between success and failure, between finding his mother and losing her trail forever. His weapons required special consideration. Kinslayer had served him well for 30 years, but it was the weapon of a solitary warrior, designed for personal combat rather than the kind of supernatural conflicts his heritage might involve. The map showed locations of ancient weapon hoards, places where the seer bloodline had hidden tools specifically crafted for dealing with otherworldly threats. The jewelry from the chest posed a different kind of decision. Each piece was clearly valuable, both financially and symbolically, but wearing them openly would mark him as someone worth robbing or kidnapping. Yet his mother's letters suggested that certain pieces, particularly a silver arm ring bearing runic inscriptions, served as identification that would be recognized by other members of the bloodline. He chose to wear the arm ring beneath his sleeve, where it would be hidden from casual observation but could be revealed when necessary. The other pieces he wrapped carefully and placed in a leather pouch that could be easily hidden or abandoned if circumstances required. The documents and maps he protected with oiled leather, ensuring they would survive whatever weather or violence his journey might encounter. As he made these preparations, Jorund found himself remembering moments from his past with new understanding. The merchant who had found him after the raid, Eric Ironhand, had possessed certain mannerisms that now seemed significant. The way he'd always seemed to know when storms were coming, his uncanny ability to find the best trade routes, his habit of speaking in cryptic phrases that seemed to contain hidden meanings. The memories surfaced as well, the strange dreams that had guided him toward promising territories during his wandering years, the way certain animals had always seemed unusually comfortable in his presence, the moments of intuitive knowledge that had kept him alive in situations where logic and experience should have failed him. What he'd attributed to luck or good instincts might have been manifestations of inherited abilities he'd never learned to recognize or develop. The most disturbing realization was how many people he'd encountered over the years who might have recognized his heritage but chosen not to reveal themselves. The bloodline had survived through secrecy and careful concealment, which meant that trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. How many times had he shared a meal or a campfire with distant relatives who had watched him carefully but said nothing, waiting to see if he would reveal knowledge of his true nature? By midday, Jorund had completed his preparations and taken one final look around the longhouse that had changed his life. The chest remained where he'd found it, but now it was empty, except for a few items he'd chosen to leave behind. Documents whose importance he didn't understand, and jewelry too valuable to risk losing. If other members of his family came looking, they would find evidence that he'd been here and learned at least part of the truth. The path toward Ironwood led through mountain terrain that grew progressively wilder and more isolated. As Jorund shouldered his pack and stepped out into the afternoon sunlight, he felt the weight of possibility pressing against his chest like a physical force. Somewhere ahead lay answers to questions he'd been asking his entire adult life. Somewhere ahead, the scattered pieces of his broken family might finally be reassembled into something whole. But with possibility came danger. His mother's letters had made clear that the enemies who had destroyed his childhood were still active, still watching for signs that the seer bloodline might be attempting to reassert its influence. Every step toward his heritage was also a step toward confrontation with forces that had already demonstrated their willingness to use deception, violence, and betrayal to achieve their goals. As he began his descent from Ravnarskog toward the hidden paths marked on his mother's map, Jorund carried with him not just the hope of reunion, but the grim knowledge that reclaiming his identity might cost him everything he'd fought to survive. The mountain path toward Ironwood proved to be more than simple terrain. It was a test that seemed designed to separate the worthy from the merely curious. Ancient stone markers appeared at regular intervals, carved with symbols that weren't quite runes, but conveyed meaning nonetheless. Following his mother's guidance, Jorund learned to read these markers not with his eyes, but with an intuition that felt both foreign and familiar, like remembering a language he'd spoken in dreams. 3 days into his journey, as he navigated a narrow ledge that skirted a precipitous drop into a mist-filled valley, Jorund encountered the first sign that his quest was being watched by forces beyond the merely human. A raven larger than any he'd ever seen perched on a dead pine at the path's edge, regarding him with an intelligence that seemed almost conversational. When he paused to rest and eat a piece of dried fish, the bird cocked its head and spoke a single word in the old tongue. Seer-born. The shock of hearing his mother's family name spoken by a creature that shouldn't have possessed the ability to form words nearly sent Jorund tumbling from the narrow ledge. But as he steadied himself against the rock face, the raven launched itself into the air and began flying in slow circles above his head, clearly expecting him to follow. Against every instinct developed during 30 years of careful survival, Jorund chose to trust this supernatural guide. The raven led him away from the marked path onto what appeared to be a game trail that wound through stands of pine so thick they blocked most of the sunlight. Here, in this green twilight, Jorund began to experience sensations that had no basis in his previous understanding of the world. The air itself seemed to hum with energy that made his skin tingle. Sounds carried farther than they should have, and seemed to contain echoes of voices speaking words in languages he didn't recognize, but somehow understood. During his second night on this hidden path, while camped in a grove where the trees grew in a perfect circle around a spring of unusually clear water, Jorund finally worked up the courage to examine the small runestone he'd found among his mother's belongings. The stone was smooth obsidian, marked with symbols that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. His mother's notes had identified it as a prophecy stone, though she'd provided no guidance about how such an artifact might be used. Holding the stone while sitting beside the spring, Jorund felt the first stirrings of the supernatural awareness his heritage promised. Images flashed through his mind, not quite visions, but impressions that carried the weight of truth. He saw himself standing before a great hall built into the side of a mountain, its entrance guarded by statues that moved when no one was watching. He saw an old woman with his mother's eyes extending her hands toward him, offering knowledge that would transform him from wanderer into something far more significant. But the most powerful image was of his mother herself, not as he remembered her from childhood, but as she appeared now, older, marked by years of captivity and hardship, but unmistakably alive. She stood in a place of white stone and running water, surrounded by others who bore the distinctive features of the seer bloodline. In the vision, she turned toward him, as if she could sense his presence across whatever distance separated them. and her lips formed words he couldn't quite hear but felt in his bones. "Come home, my giant." The prophecy stone grew warm in his hands, and suddenly the grove around him filled with whispers, not threatening but urgent, as if the very trees were trying to convey information faster than his mortal mind could process. When the sensation faded, Jorund found that he understood things he hadn't known moments before. The path ahead would lead him to Ironwood, but Ironwood was only the beginning. His true destination lay much farther north, in a place called the Sanctuary of Echoes, where the last free members of the seer bloodline maintained their ancient traditions. The knowledge came with warnings as well. His enemies had not been idle during the 30 years since his family's destruction. They had agents throughout the northern territories, people who watched for signs of seer activity and reported back to masters whose names were spoken only in whispers. Some of these agents were motivated by gold or position, but others served willingly, believing that the supernatural gifts of the seer bloodline represented a threat to the natural order that had to be eliminated. On the 4th morning of his journey, as he crested a ridge that offered his first view of the Ironwood Valley, Jorund encountered a figure that drove home the reality of these dangers. An old man sat beside the trail, apparently resting during his own travels, but his presence triggered every survival instinct Jorund had developed during his years of wandering. The stranger's clothing was too fine for a simple traveler, his weapons too well maintained, his manner of watching the approach too practiced. "Greetings, friend," the old man called out when Jorund came within speaking distance. "These paths can be treacherous for those who don't know the proper way. Perhaps you'd welcome some guidance from someone familiar with local conditions." The offer seemed reasonable enough, but something in the man's eyes reminded Jorund of the wolves he'd encountered during harsh winters, predators who had learned to appear harmless until the moment they struck. More importantly, the prophecy stone in his pack had grown noticeably warm, as if responding to some threat his conscious mind hadn't yet recognized. "I appreciate the offer," Jorund replied carefully, "but I've always found that the best way to learn a path is to walk it yourself. Too much guidance can rob a man of the lessons the journey is meant to teach." The old man's smile never wavered, but something shifted in his posture that suggested the conversation had moved beyond casual pleasantries. Wise words, though they sound like something a person might learn from unusual teachers. The kind of teachers who deal in old knowledge and forgotten ways. The comment was clearly a probe, designed to see if Jorund would reveal knowledge of the seer traditions. In response, Jorund let his hand drift casually toward Kinslayer's handle while maintaining the relaxed demeanor of someone discussing weather or trail conditions. "All knowledge was new once," he said, using one of the phrases his mother's letters had identified as a safe response to such probing. "Some of us just take longer to learn it than others." The old man's eyes sharpened with interest, and Jorund realized he'd made a mistake. Instead of deflecting suspicion, his response had apparently confirmed something the stranger had been testing for. The prophecy stone's warmth increased noticeably, and in the sudden tension that filled the air between them, Jorund understood that his quest to reclaim his heritage had already attracted the attention of those who preferred the seer bloodline to remain extinct. The confrontation that followed would be brief but instructive, teaching Jorund that the supernatural abilities dormant in his blood could manifest under pressure in ways that would have seemed impossible just days before. But more importantly, it would confirm that the enemies who had stolen his childhood were still active, still watching, and still willing to kill anyone who threatened their carefully maintained fiction about the fate of the seer bloodline. The village of Ironwood nestled in a valley so perfectly hidden that Jorund might have walked past it a dozen times without noticing its existence, only by following the ancient markers and trusting the guidance of forces he was still learning to understand. Had he found the narrow passage between two seemingly solid rock faces that opened onto a settlement unlike any he'd encountered. In 30 years of wandering, the buildings themselves appeared ordinary enough, wooden structures built in the traditional style. with steep roofs and carved details that spoke of prosperity and care. But the people who moved between these buildings carried themselves with a quality that set them apart from typical villagers. They moved with purpose, but without haste, spoke in voices that carried farther than they should have, and seemed to notice things that weren't quite visible to ordinary perception. Jorund's arrival didn't go unnoticed. Even before he'd fully emerged from the hidden passage, a small group had gathered in the village center, waiting with the patient attention of people who had been expecting him. Among them stood an elderly woman whose bearing suggested authority, flanked by two younger men who bore the distinctive tall frame and sharp features he was beginning to recognize as markers of the seer bloodline. "Jorund Bearcloak," the woman said when he approached, her voice carrying the kind of certainty that comes from supernatural knowledge rather than simple observation. "Son of Astrid Seerborn and Gunnar Sigtesson, you carry the weight of 30 years' ignorance, but also the strength that comes from surviving without the crutch of inherited privilege. Welcome to the first of your father's true homes." The formal recognition hit him like a physical blow. After 3 decades of being nobody special, of being defined entirely by his own actions and choices, suddenly he was someone with a heritage that stretched back through generations of legendary figures. The woman, who introduced herself as Helga Ironwill, his father's sister, regarded him with eyes that seemed to look through his surface appearance to evaluate the man he'd become. "You have questions," she continued, "and we have some answers. But first, you must understand that knowledge comes with obligations. Your father's bloodline carries responsibilities that cannot be ignored or abandoned once accepted. Are you prepared to learn who you really are, even if that knowledge transforms you into someone you might not recognize?" Jorund thought of his mother's letters, of the prophecy stone that had shown him visions of a destiny larger than mere survival, of the enemies who were already hunting him simply because of his birth. "I've lived 30 years as a lie," he replied. "I think I can handle the burden of living as the truth." Helga's smile carried approval, mixed with something that might have been pity. "Then come, let us show you what it means to be the last son of the Seer Kings." The great hall at Ironwood Center proved to be far more than a simple meeting place. Its walls were lined with artifacts that hummed with barely contained power, weapons forged from meteoric iron, shields that seemed to shift color in changing light, and carved stones covered with runes that made Jorund's eyes water if he looked at them too directly. This was a repository of the supernatural legacy his bloodline had accumulated over centuries of walking the boundary between the mortal world and the realm of gods. Helga led him to a raised platform where a silver ring rested on a cushion of midnight blue silk. The ring was deceptively simple in appearance, a band of metal marked with engravings so fine they seemed to have been made by insects rather than human craftsmen. But the moment Jorund's fingers closed around it, the hall filled with the sound of voices speaking in unison, chanting words in the old tongue that resonated in his bones. "The family seal," Helga explained as the supernatural chorus faded. "It has waited 30 years for your touch. Wear it, and every member of the scattered bloodline will recognize your legitimacy. But understand, once you put it on, you cannot simply be Jorund the Wanderer anymore. You become Jorund Sigtesson, heir to obligations that have been building interest for 3 decades. The ring fit his finger as if it had been made specifically for him, which, according to Helga, it had. Each heir received a ring forged at the moment of their birth, infused with metal drawn from the same meteorite that had created the first seer artifacts generations earlier. The crafting was done by the finest smiths the bloodline could find, working with tools blessed by priests of the old gods and using techniques that had been carefully guarded for centuries. But the ring's true power became apparent when Helga began, explaining the political situation that surrounded his heritage. The seer bloodline had once been the power behind multiple thrones, advising jarls and kings with wisdom drawn from supernatural sources. Their influence had grown so great that other noble families had begun to see them as a threat to the established order, leading to the coordinated campaign of destruction that had shattered Jorund's childhood. Your appearance, Helga continued, creates problems for people who have spent 30 years building their power on the assumption that our bloodline was extinct. Some will try to use you for their own purposes. Others will try to eliminate you before you can reclaim what is rightfully yours. A few might even attempt to make alliances, though their motives will always be suspect. The younger men flanking Helga introduced themselves as his cousins, Ragnar Ironwill and Eric Stormcrow, both bearing scars that spoke of recent conflicts. They explained that the survivors of the bloodline had been engaged in a careful game of resistance and survival, working to preserve their traditions while avoiding the kind of open confrontation that had led to the original catastrophe. "We've been waiting for you," Ragnar said bluntly. "Not just because you're family, but because the prophecies speak of an heir who would return from the exile to unite the scattered clans. Your size, your survival skills, your arrival at this particular moment, everything suggests you might be the one the seers foretold." Eric nodded agreement, though his expression carried warnings as well as hope. "But the prophecies also speak of great danger. Your return will trigger responses from enemies who have grown comfortable with our apparent extinction. Some of those enemies have spent 30 years infiltrating positions of power, building networks of influence that will be threatened by any resurgence of seer authority." The political complexities were staggering. Jorund learned that several jarls who now ruled northern territories had gained their positions by betraying seer allies during the original purge. Others had built their wealth by seizing properties that had belonged to murdered bloodline members. His simple desire to find his mother and reclaim his heritage would inevitably threaten established power structures that had billions of silver pieces and thousands of lives invested in maintaining the current order. But perhaps most disturbing was the revelation that some members of the bloodline itself had chosen collaboration over resistance. Fear and pragmatism had led certain seer families to make bargains with the enemies, trading loyalty for survival and gradually abandoning the traditions that had once made them powerful. These collaborators now occupied positions within the resistance network, making it impossible to know which allies could be trusted and which might betray crucial information to hostile forces. As night fell over Ironwood, Jorund found himself standing at the threshold of a world far more complex and dangerous than anything his years of solitary wandering had prepared him for. The ring on his finger marked him as legitimate heir to power and responsibility he'd never sought, while the knowledge he'd gained revealed enemies and obligations that would reshape every aspect of his future. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of his education in the supernatural arts his heritage promised, but tonight he could only contemplate the magnitude of what he'd chosen to embrace. The Blood Oath scroll lay unrolled on the ancient oak table like a serpent waiting to strike. Helga's weathered hands trembled slightly as she held down the corners of the parchment, its surface covered with text written in the formal language, reserved for the most binding supernatural agreements. The words seemed to writhe in the candlelight, and Jorund understood why his aunt had waited until his second day in Ironwood to reveal this particular burden of his inheritance. "Your father swore this oath 3 days before your birth," Helga explained, her voice carrying the weight of 30 years' regret. "He believed that the power it would grant him could protect your mother and secure your future. Instead, it became the weapon his enemies used to destroy everything he loved. The oath itself was elegant in its complexity and terrifying in its implications. Gunnar Sigtyrson had bound himself and his male descendants to serve as the supernatural guardians of the northern territories, wielding the full power of the seer bloodline to prevent the return of an ancient evil that slumbered beneath the glacial ice. In exchange, he had been granted access to mystical abilities that elevated him far beyond the normal limits of human perception and influence. But The oath contained a clause that his enemies had exploited with devastating effectiveness. If the guardian failed to properly train his heir in the supernatural arts, or if the bloodline was disrupted for more than one generation, the protective barriers would begin to weaken. The evil that had been contained for centuries would start to stir. Drawn by the growing vulnerability of the mystical defenses, "They didn't need to kill you," Helga continued, her fingers tracing the elaborate signatures at the document's bottom. "They just needed to ensure you never learned what you were supposed to become. By separating you from your family and heritage, they triggered the oath's failure conditions. Every year you've lived in ignorance has been another year that the ancient protections have grown weaker." Jorund stared at the scroll, feeling the weight of cosmic responsibility settling on his shoulders like a cloak made of lead. His entire adult life had been built around the simple goal of survival, of making it through each day without getting killed or starving. Now he was learning that his ignorance had been slowly endangering not just his own bloodline, but potentially every living thing in the Northern Territories. "What happens if I refuse?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The oath cannot be refused," came a new voice from the hall's entrance. The woman who entered moved with the careful grace of someone whose bones had been broken and healed more than once. But her eyes held depths of knowledge that spoke of supernatural sight, developed over decades of practice. "I am Valdis Truthseer, your father's cousin, and the keeper of our most dangerous secrets. The blood oath binds every male descendant, whether they accept it willingly or not." Valdis approached the table with the reverence due to a sacred relic, though her expression suggested she viewed the scroll more as a curse than a blessing. Her presence seemed to intensify the supernatural atmosphere in the hall, making the carved runes on the walls glow with faint phosphorescence, and causing the candle flames to dance. "Without any detectable breeze, your training should have begun on your 13th birthday," she continued, settling into a chair that groaned under what seemed like more than just physical weight. "By now, you should have spent 17 years learning to read the patterns that connect all living things, to speak with the spirits of the ancestors, to channel power that flows from the deep places of the earth. Instead, you've been wandering the wilderness like a particularly large and dangerous animal." The criticism stung, but Jorund recognized the truth in it. His supernatural abilities had manifested randomly and without control, useful for survival, but lacking the focused development that proper training would have provided. The prophecy stone's visions came unpredictably, his enhanced senses activated only under stress, and his connection to the mystical forces his heritage promised remained frustratingly intermittent. "Can the lost time be recovered?" he asked, dreading the answer. Valdis exchanged a long look with Helga before responding. "Partially. Your natural development of survival instincts has created a foundation we can build on, and your size indicates that some of the bloodline gifts have been expressing themselves despite your ignorance. But the formal training typically takes 2 decades to complete, and we may have months rather than years before the ancient evil recognizes the weakness in our defenses." The next several hours introduced Jorund to concepts that challenged everything he thought he knew about the nature of reality. The seer bloodline's abilities weren't simply enhanced intuition or unusually good luck. They were manifestations of a connection to what Valdis called the deep current, a flow of mystical energy that connected all living things and could be channeled by those with the proper training and bloodline heritage. "Feel the pulse beneath your thoughts," Valdis instructed, placing her hand on his forehead in a gesture that immediately filled his mind with sensations he'd never experienced. "That rhythm isn't your heartbeat, it's the breathing of the world itself. Your ancestors learned to synchronize their own life force with that greater rhythm, drawing power from the connection." The training began immediately, with exercises designed to awaken dormant abilities that had been waiting 30 years for proper guidance. Jorund learned to quiet his conscious mind enough to perceive the threads of connection that linked every person, animal, and growing thing in an invisible web of influence. He practiced channeling his own life energy through specific patterns that amplified his natural strength and perception, but the most disturbing part of his education came when Valdis revealed the true nature of the threat his father's oath had been designed to contain. Beneath the northern glaciers lay something that predated human civilization, an entity or force that fed on chaos and conflict, growing stronger whenever communities turned against each other or abandoned the cooperative bonds that allowed them to survive in harsh environments. It has many names in the old songs, Valdis explained as they stood before a wall carving that depicted creatures of shadow consuming villages. The unraveler, the breaker of bonds, the eater of trust. When it was last free, before your ancestors bound it, entire peoples simply vanished from the world. Not killed, erased, as if they had never existed at all. The binding ritual that contained this entity required constant renewal by guardians who understood both the threat and the specific mystical techniques needed to maintain the protective barriers. Each generation of the seer bloodline had trained successors to continue the work, passing down knowledge and power through carefully maintained traditions. Your father's generation broke that chain, Helga said when they returned to the Great Hall. Not intentionally, but decisively. When they scattered or killed the families who carried the guardian bloodlines, they created gaps in the protective network that have been growing wider every year. The most chilling revelation came when Valdis produced a map that showed the current state of the mystical barriers. Red marks indicated locations where the protections had already failed completely, while amber areas showed places where the defenses were weakening rapidly. The pattern that emerged suggested systematic destruction rather than random decay. Someone or something was actively working to accelerate the barrier failures. We believe some of your father's enemies know exactly what they've accomplished, Valdis said, her finger tracing lines of failure that pointed toward populated settlements. They may have made bargains with the entity itself, trading the destruction of the guardian bloodlines for promises of power when it finally breaks free. As night settled over Ironwood for the second time since his arrival, Jorund found himself facing a choice that would define not just his own future, but potentially the survival of everyone in the Northern Territories. He could attempt to fulfill his father's oath, accepting training and responsibilities that would transform him into something far removed from the simple warrior he'd always been. Or he could walk away, returning to his wandering life while knowing that his refusal might doom thousands of innocent people to a fate worse than death. The weight of the decision pressed against him like a physical force, made heavier by the knowledge that whatever choice he made would have to be implemented quickly. The ancient evil his bloodline had contained for generations was stirring, and time was running out for both the Guardians and the people they had sworn to protect. The false death certificate lay spread across the table, like an accusation, written in faded ink and official seals. Jorund had been studying the mystical texts in Ironwood's archive when Valdis burst into the hall, her face pale with a mixture of excitement and terror that made his blood run cold. In her trembling hands she carried a leather satchel that bore the travel stains of a long, desperate journey. "A messenger arrived an hour ago," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "From the Sanctuary of Echoes. Your mother, Jorund, your mother is alive." The words hit him with more force than any physical blow he'd ever received. For 3 days, he'd been learning to accept the magnitude of his inherited responsibilities, the weight of ancient oaths and cosmic threats that demanded his attention. But beneath all of that had been the growing certainty that his mother was lost forever, that the letters in the chest had been her final gift to a son she would never see again. "The certificate is a forgery," Valdis continued, unrolling the document with hands that shook despite her obvious effort to maintain composure. "Astrid Searborn was never killed during the raid on your village. She was taken, along with 7 other women who possessed bloodline gifts. They've been held at the Sanctuary of Echoes for 30 years, their abilities used to maintain the very barriers we thought were failing from neglect. Jorund sank into a chair that suddenly felt unable to support his weight. The implications crashed over him in waves, each revelation recontextualizing everything he'd learned about his heritage and his family's fate. His mother hadn't just survived. She'd been working to preserve the mystical protections his father's oath had established, even while being held prisoner by the same enemies who had orchestrated the destruction of their family. "She knows about you," Valdis said, producing a letter written on paper so fine it seemed to glow in the candlelight. The messenger carried this from her directly. "She's been watching your journey, guiding it when she could, waiting for you to grow strong enough to find your way to the truth." The letter was written in his mother's careful script, but the words were those of a woman who had endured decades of captivity while maintaining hope that seemed almost superhuman in its persistence. She wrote about watching him through mystical means, seeing him develop into the man his father had envisioned, taking pride in his survival and strength, even while mourning the childhood they'd both lost. "My dearest son," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then the gods have finally deemed you ready to learn the full truth about our family's fate. Everything you've discovered so far, the chest, the letters, even your arrival in Ironwood, has been orchestrated according to plans I made before you were old enough to walk. I've been preparing for this moment for 30 years. The letter revealed a conspiracy that made the political complexities Helga had described seem simple by comparison. Astrid and the other captured seer women had been kept alive specifically because their combined mystical abilities were needed to maintain the barriers containing the ancient evil. Their captors weren't trying to destroy the Guardian system, they were trying to control it, to become the sole arbiters of who lived and died in the Northern Territories. The men who destroyed our village were not acting from ignorance or simple greed, his mother wrote. They were servants of a cabal that had spent generations studying our bloodline's abilities, learning to duplicate some of our powers while eliminating our independence. They needed our mystical strength, but they couldn't tolerate our freedom to use that strength according to our own judgment. The Sanctuary of Echoes, which Jorund had envisioned as a hidden refuge, where the remnants of his bloodline lived in safety, was revealed to be something far more sinister. It was a prison designed specifically to contain seer women, built in a location where the natural mystical currents could be channeled and focused through their abilities. The women were kept alive and relatively comfortable, but they were essentially mystical slaves, forced to pour their power into maintaining barriers that served their captors' political goals. "We have been the Guardian Network," Astrid wrote, her words carrying a bitterness that 30 years of captivity had failed to extinguish. "While you wandered the world believing yourself orphaned, we have been the ones preventing the ancient evil from breaking free. But our captors have grown careless in their confidence, and opportunities for escape have begun to present themselves." The letter detailed a plan that was breathtaking in its complexity and terrifying in its implications. For the past 5 years, Astrid and her fellow captives had been secretly working to weaken the very barriers they were forced to maintain, creating controlled failures that would draw Jorund toward his heritage, while making their captors believe the mystical protections were degrading naturally. Every vision you've experienced, every supernatural encounter that guided your path, was the result of our careful manipulation of the mystical currents, she revealed. "We have been calling you home, my son, not just for reunion, but for liberation. The ancient evil is real, and it must be contained, but not by slaves serving masters who would use cosmic threats to maintain their political power." The most shocking revelation came in the letter's final paragraphs. The entity beneath the glaciers hadn't been trying to break free. It had been trying to communicate with the Guardian Network to warn them about an even greater threat that was approaching from beyond the mortal world. The cabal controlling the sanctuary had been deliberately suppressing these communications, preventing the Guardians from learning about dangers that made the contained evil seem minor by comparison. The true threat comes from those who would break the boundary between the world of mortals and the realm of gods, Astrid wrote. Our captors serve powers that exist beyond death, entities that seek to remake our world according to their own vision of order. The ancient evil beneath the ice is not our enemy. It is a potential ally that has been imprisoned by the same forces that now hold us. Valdis had been reading over Jorund's shoulder, and her sharp intake of breath indicated that she understood the implications as clearly as he did. Everything they'd been taught about their heritage, about the nature of the threats they faced, about the purpose of the Guardian network itself, had been carefully crafted deception designed to keep them serving interests they didn't understand. If this is true, Valdis said slowly, then we've been helping our enemies for 30 years. Every ritual we've performed, every barrier we've maintained, every tradition we've preserved, all of it has been serving the people who destroyed our families. The letter included detailed maps and intelligence about the sanctuary's defenses, information that could only have been gathered by someone with intimate knowledge of the prison's operations. Astrid had spent 3 decades planning this moment, preparing for the day when her son would be strong enough and skilled enough to lead a rescue mission that would free the captive seer women and finally reveal the true nature of the forces arrayed against their bloodline. But the mission would be far more dangerous than simply infiltrating a heavily guarded fortress. The mystical barriers containing the ancient evil were linked directly to the life forces of the captive women. Freeing them would mean allowing the entity beneath the glaciers to break its bonds, a risk that could lead to the destruction of everything in the Northern Territories if Astrid's assessment of the situation proved incorrect. You must choose, the letter concluded, between the safety of ignorance and the terrible responsibility of truth. If you come for us, you will be committing yourself to a conflict that reaches beyond the mortal world into realms where the very concepts of life and death become meaningless. But if you abandon us to our fate, you will be allowing forces of cosmic tyranny to tighten their grip on our world until no free will remains for any living thing. As Jorund set down the letter, he felt the foundations of his understanding shifting once again. The simple quest to find his mother had become something far more complex, a choice between accepting the world as it appeared to be or fighting to reveal truths that might prove more dangerous than the lies they would replace. The ring on his finger, which had seemed like a symbol of belonging and legitimacy, now felt like a shackle connecting him to responsibilities he'd never asked for and consequences he couldn't fully comprehend. Outside the hall, ravens were gathering in numbers that suggested supernatural significance. Their cries carried messages in the old tongue, and Jorund understood without conscious translation that they were announcing the beginning of events that would reshape the balance of power between the mortal world and the realms beyond. The time for preparation and gradual learning had ended. Tomorrow he would have to choose whether to honor the blood oath that bound him to protect the established order, or to break faith with everything he'd been taught in order to serve a truth that promised to be more dangerous than any lie. The Guardian's horn lay on the altar, like a weapon forged from starlight and shadow, made from the horn of a creature that had died before the first humans walked the earth, bound with silver that had fallen from the sky during the Age of Legends. It represented power that could summon aid from realms beyond mortal understanding. Valdis handled it with the reverence due to an artifact that could reshape the balance between life and death, while Jorund studied the intricate carvings that seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them. Your father was the last to sound this horn, she explained, her voice carrying the weight of memories that stretched back through decades of loss. He called upon the spirits of every seer guardian who had died defending the Northern Territories, and for one terrible night, The dead walked among the living to hold back forces that would have consumed everything we hold dear. But the cost was enormous. Using the horn ages the one who sounds it, and your father never fully recovered from that single call. 3 days had passed since the revelation about his mother's imprisonment. 3 days of intensive preparation that had pushed Jorund's newly awakened abilities to their absolute limits. Valdis and Helga had worked tirelessly to compress years of training into a crash course that would give him some chance of surviving what they all knew was likely a suicide mission. Sleep had become a luxury none of them could afford. Meals were eaten standing while reviewing maps and discussing strategies, and every waking moment was dedicated to preparing for an assault on a fortress that had never been successfully attacked. The Sanctuary of Echoes occupied a position that was both strategically perfect and mystically significant, built into the side of a mountain that contained veins of meteoric metal surrounded by natural formations that channeled and amplified supernatural energies. It was simultaneously a prison, a fortress, and a massive mystical engine that could tap into forces most people couldn't even imagine. The approaches were defended by both human guards and supernatural barriers that would kill most intruders before they came within sight of the walls. The outer defenses are designed to handle conventional assault, Ragnar explained as he traced attack routes on a map that had been updated with intelligence from Astrid's letter. Crossbow positions here and here, a clear killing field that extends 500 yards from the main gate, watchtowers positioned to provide overlapping coverage of any approach. A normal warband would be slaughtered before they got close enough to matter. But the inner defenses are worse, Eric added, his expression grim with the knowledge of what they would face. Mystical barriers that can turn a man's own life force against him, spirit guardians that have been bound to protect the fortress until the end of time, and traps that exist partially in other dimensions where normal weapons and armor provide no protection. The assault plan they developed was necessarily complex, relying on Jorund's growing supernatural abilities and the desperate hope that Astrid and the other captive women would be able to provide assistance from within. The Guardian's horn would be crucial to their success, but using it carried risks that made everyone involved question whether victory would be worth the cost. The spirits of the Guardian dead are not entirely under the control of whoever sounds the horn, Valdis warned, as she showed Jorund the proper way to hold the ancient artifact. They come with their own agendas, their own understanding of what needs to be done. Some may help you exactly as you expect. Others might decide that the best way to serve the greater good is to prevent you from reaching your mother at all. The supernatural allies they hoped to gather represented the accumulated power of generations, of seer guardians, men and women who had died defending the mystical barriers that protected the northern territories. But death had not ended their connection to the world of the living, and the horn could call them back to continue battles they had fought while alive. The risk was that once summoned, these spirits might prove impossible to dismiss, creating a situation where the cure became worse than the disease. Jorund's training in the horn's use had revealed aspects of his heritage that were both exhilarating and terrifying. When he touched the ancient artifact, his consciousness expanded to encompass not just his own memories, but fragments of experience that belonged to his ancestors. He could feel their presence like a vast crowd, standing just beyond the edge of perception, waiting for permission to step back into the world they had left behind. Each spirit you call will take something from you, Helga warned as she supervised his practice sessions. A year of your life, a cherished memory, a piece of your soul that you'll never get back. The horn doesn't grant power for free. It trades the future for the present, and the debt always comes due eventually. The weapons and equipment they'd assembled for the assault were as much ritual implements as practical tools. Jorund's axe, Kinslayer, had been blessed with oils that would allow it to cut through mystical barriers as well as flesh and bone. His armor had been inscribed with protective runes that would provide some defense against supernatural attacks. though nothing could fully protect against the kind of forces they expected to encounter. The most crucial preparation involved learning to work as a team with allies who possessed abilities that complemented his own raw power. Ragnar and Eric had spent years developing their supernatural skills, and they would be essential to navigating the complex mystical defenses that protected the sanctuary. But the three of them had never worked together in combat, and their first real test would come under circumstances where a single mistake could doom not just the mission, but potentially everyone in the Northern Territories. Trust your instincts, Veldis advised during their final planning session. Your bloodline gifts may be underdeveloped, but they're still stronger than what most people can achieve with decades of training. When the mystical defenses react to your presence, don't try to fight them directly. Find ways to redirect their energy or use their own power against them. The maps provided by Astrid revealed hidden passages and weak points in the sanctuary's defenses, but they also made clear the true scope of what they were attempting. The fortress had been designed by people who understood both conventional warfare and supernatural combat, and every entrance was defended by multiple layers of protection that would challenge even experienced warriors. The timing of their assault would be crucial. Astrid's letter had indicated that the mystical barriers containing the ancient evil were renewed during specific celestial alignments, times when the captive women were forced to channel maximum power into the containment system. During these periods, the normal defenses around the sanctuary would be weakened as energy was diverted to maintain the barriers. We'll have perhaps 6 hours when the outer mystical defenses are operating at reduced strength, Eric calculated as he studied astronomical charts that tracked the relevant celestial bodies. But that's also when the stakes are highest. If we disrupt the barrier renewal process at the wrong moment, we might accidentally release the ancient evil before we're prepared to deal with it. The question of what to do about the entity beneath the glaciers remained unresolved. Astrid's letter suggested it might be an ally rather than an enemy, but 30 years of imprisonment could have changed its disposition considerably. Even if it had originally been benevolent, decades of mystical suppression might have driven it mad with rage and hunger for revenge. We're gambling the fate of the world on your mother's assessment of something that's been locked away since before our great-grandfathers were born, Ragnar pointed out with characteristic bluntness. If she's wrong, if the ancient evil has been contained for good reasons, then freeing it could lead to catastrophe on a scale that makes our current problem seem trivial. The weight of that responsibility pressed against Jorund's chest like a physical force. Every decision he made during the assault would ripple outward through consequences he couldn't fully predict or control. Saving his mother might mean dooming thousands of innocent people, while leaving her imprisoned might mean allowing cosmic tyranny to tighten its grip on the mortal world. As the final night before their departure settled over Ironwood, Jorund found himself standing alone in the Great Hall, studying the Guardian's horn by candlelight and trying to prepare himself mentally for what morning would bring. The ancient artifact seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, and he could feel the presence of the Guardian's spirits pressing against the boundaries that separated the living from the dead. Tomorrow, he would sound the horn and call upon powers that might save or damn everything he cared about. He would assault a fortress that had never fallen, attempt to rescue women who had been prisoners for longer than he'd been alive, and make decisions that would reshape the mystical landscape of the Northern Territories. The wandering warrior who had discovered an ancient chest in an abandoned village was about to become something far more significant and far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. Possible. The ravens outside had been calling all evening, their voices carrying messages in the old tongue that spoke of change coming like a storm from the distant mountains. As Jorund prepared for sleep that might be his last, he understood that tomorrow would mark either the beginning of his family's liberation or the final chapter in a bloodline that had protected the North for countless generations. Either way, The man who returned from the Sanctuary of Echoes would bear little resemblance to the one who had wandered alone through empty lands. Carrying the weight of beliefs that had proved to be carefully constructed lies, the approach to the Sanctuary of Echoes began before dawn, when the mountain air carried the bite of winter and the stars overhead seemed closer than they should have been. Jorund led the small assault force through terrain that existed partially in the mystical realm, where distances could stretch or compress depending on the intentions of those who traveled them. The sanctuary key, forged from meteoric iron that had fallen during the first winter, hung heavy in his pack, its weight seeming to increase with each step toward their destination. The outer defenses revealed themselves gradually as morning light crept across the mountain faces. What had appeared to be natural rock formations from a distance proved to be carefully crafted barriers that channeled approaching threats into predetermined killing zones. Crossbow positions carved into the cliff face commanded every viable approach, while mystical wards hummed with energy that made Jorund's teeth ache and his newly awakened supernatural senses scream warnings. "The human guards know we're coming," Eric whispered as they crouched behind a boulder that provided scant cover from the watchtowers above. "But they can't see us clearly through the mystical interference their own defenses create. We have perhaps an hour before they organize a proper response." The Guardian's horn felt warm against Jorund's chest where he wore it beneath his armor. Every few minutes he could sense the spirits of dead Guardians pressing against the boundaries that separated life from death, eager to answer the call that would allow them to complete battles they had left unfinished. But Valdis had been clear about the timing. The horn's power was best saved for the most desperate moments, when conventional weapons and tactics had failed completely. The first breach came through a weakness Astrid's intelligence had identified, a drainage channel that carried runoff from the mountain peaks through a gap in the sanctuary's outer wall. The channel was defended by mystical barriers that would have killed most intruders instantly. But Jorund's bloodline heritage allowed him to perceive the pattern underlying the deadly energies and find a path through them. Moving through the barrier felt like swimming through liquid fire that tested every aspect of his supernatural resistance. The mystical defenses probed his intentions, his bloodline, his right to be approaching their protected territory. For a moment that stretched toward eternity, Jorund felt the barriers deciding whether to admit him or reduce him to ash, and he understood that his fate hung on factors beyond his conscious control. Then he was through, gasping and disoriented but alive, with Ragnar and Eric following close behind. The inner courtyard of the sanctuary stretched before them, its architectural elements clearly designed to channel and focus mystical energies rather than provide simple defense against human attackers. Crystalline formations jutted from the ground at precise intervals, their surfaces reflecting light that came from no visible source. The first human guards appeared as they crossed the courtyard, men wearing armor marked with symbols that hurt to look at directly. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They moved with the fluid grace of people whose reflexes had been enhanced through mystical means, and their weapons glowed with enchantments that would cut through normal armor like parchment. Combat erupted with a violence that seemed to shake the mountain itself. Jorund's axe, Kinslayer, rang against enhanced blades, while mystical energies crackled through the air around them. His size and strength, amplified by his growing supernatural abilities, allowed him to fight multiple opponents simultaneously. But the enemy's mystical enhancements made them far more dangerous than normal humans. "The inner sanctum is beyond that archway," Ragnar shouted over the sound of battle, his sword trailing fire as he cut down a guard whose armor had been inscribed with protective runes. "But the mystical defenses there will be concentrated. We'll need the horn's power to break through." Eric was engaged with 3 opponents at once, his movements flowing like water as he used techniques that seemed to bend space around him. But even his enhanced abilities were being pressed to their limits, and Jorund could see that conventional combat wouldn't be enough to reach the heart of the sanctuary, where his mother and the other captive women were being held. The moment of decision arrived, when the main gates of the inner sanctum began to glow with accumulated power, preparing to unleash defenses that would incinerate everything in the courtyard. Jorund pulled the Guardian's horn from beneath his armor and felt the immediate response of spirits who had been waiting decades for the chance to continue their interrupted battles. The horn's voice, when he sounded it, was not heard so much as felt, a vibration that reached through the boundary between life and death to call upon powers that should have remained forever beyond mortal reach. The air around them shimmered as translucent figures began to materialize. The spirits of guardian warriors who had died defending the mystical, barriers that protected the northern territories. But with their arrival came the immediate understanding that these spirits brought their own agenda to the battlefield. Some moved to aid Jorund and his companions, their spectral weapons proving devastatingly effective against both human guards and mystical barriers. Others seemed more interested in settling old scores with enemies who had been dead for generations, filling the courtyard with conflicts that belonged to bygone eras. The sanctuary key grew burning hot against Jorund's hand as he approached the inner sanctum's sealed entrance, its meteoric iron responding to mystical forces that had been building for 30 years. Through the growing chaos of battle, both mortal and supernatural, he could hear something that made his heart race with desperate hope. His mother's voice, raised in what sounded like an incantation designed to weaken the barriers that had held her captive for 3 decades. The sanctuary key turned in the ancient lock with a sound like thunder rolling through distant valleys. As the massive doors of the inner sanctum swung open, Jorund felt the accumulated mystical pressure of 30 years rush past him like a wind that carried the essence of imprisoned souls. The chamber beyond was vast and circular, its walls lined with crystalline formations that pulsed with captured life energy, and at its center stood 8 women whose presence seemed to anchor reality itself. His mother stood among them, older than his memories, but unmistakably the woman who had called him her giant and hidden him from raiders so many years ago. Astrid Searborn raised her head as he entered, and the smile that crossed her weathered face carried enough warmth to melt the glacial ice that capped the surrounding peaks. Around her, the other captive women continued their mystical work, maintaining barriers that contained forces capable of reshaping the world. But their eyes tracked his movement with desperate hope. "My son," Astrid said, her voice carrying across the chamber despite the mystical energies that crackled through the air. "You've grown into everything your father saw in the flames. But you must understand, breaking our bonds will release more than just us. Are you prepared for what that will mean?" The mother's blessing, amulet that hung around Astrid's neck, began to glow as Jorund approached, its carved surface responding to his proximity with light that seemed to heal something broken in his soul. For 30 years, he'd carried the weight of abandonment and loss, believing himself alone in a world that had no place for him. Now, standing before the woman who had sacrificed her freedom to protect mystical barriers she'd never agreed to maintain, he felt pieces of himself clicking into place, like bones healing after a long break. But the reunion was interrupted by a presence that filled the chamber with malevolent intelligence. The entity that controlled the sanctuary had been drawn by the disturbance, its consciousness pressing against their minds like a weight that threatened to crush individual thought. When it spoke, its voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Carrying authority that had been accumulating for centuries, "The heir returns," it said, amusement and contempt mixing in tones that hurt to hear. "But he comes too late to change anything that matters. The barriers his mother and her companions maintain serve purposes larger than their small understanding can encompass. Their freedom would mean the collapse of an order that has protected this world from chaos for longer than mortal." Memory. Jorund felt the entity's attention focus on him, with an intensity that made his vision blur and his bones ache. This was the mastermind behind the conspiracy that had destroyed his childhood, the intelligence that had spent decades orchestrating events to serve its own incomprehensible agenda. It existed partially beyond the mortal realm, which made it nearly invulnerable to conventional weapons. But his supernatural heritage provided tools that could reach across dimensional boundaries. You offer them freedom, the entity continued. But what you're really offering is the destruction of everything they've worked to preserve. The ancient evil beneath the glaciers stirs because their containment efforts are weakening. Release them, and you condemn every living thing in the Northern Territories to a fate worse than death. Astrid stepped forward, her chains ringing with a sound like distant bells. And when she spoke, her voice carried power that made the crystalline formations hum in harmony. He lies with truths and speaks falsehood through facts. The ancient evil stirs because it recognizes the approach of something far worse, entities from beyond the mortal realm that would remake our world according to their vision of perfect order. What sleeps beneath the ice is not our enemy, but our only hope of maintaining the freedom to choose our own destiny. The chamber filled with mystical energies as the conflict between truth and deception reached a breaking point. Jorund could feel the ancient evil stirring far below, responding to the weakening of the barriers that had held it for so long. But alongside that stirring came something else, a communication attempt, a desperate effort to reach the minds of those who might be willing to listen rather than simply react with fear. The mother's blessing amulet grew warm against his chest as Astrid extended her hands toward him, offering not just reunion but transformation. The artifact had been created to heal spiritual wounds and restore connections that had been severed by trauma and loss. When their hands touched, Jorund felt 30 years of pain and loneliness dissolving like ice in spring sunlight. Together, Astrid whispered, her voice carrying power that resonated through the mystical framework surrounding them. Together we can break not just my chains, but the larger bondage that has trapped our world in patterns of fear and submission. The ancient evil is not evil at all. It is wildness, freedom, the right of living things to grow and change without permission from cosmic authorities. The moment of choice had arrived. Jorund could maintain the status quo, preserving an order that had kept his mother imprisoned for 30 years, but had also prevented catastrophic change. Or he could trust her assessment of forces beyond his understanding, risking everything on the hope that freedom was worth whatever chaos it might bring. As he raised Kinslayer to strike at the mystical chains that bound his mother, Jorund understood that this single action would reshape the balance of power between order and chaos, between safety and freedom, between the world as it was and the world as it might become. 6 months after the liberation of the Sanctuary of Echoes, Jorund stood on a hill overlooking the new settlement that had grown from the ashes of old certainties. The village bore no resemblance to the traditional Norse communities he'd known during his wandering years. Instead, it represented something unprecedented, a place where the scattered survivors of the seer bloodline could gather, without fear of persecution or the need for constant concealment. At the new clan banner that flew above the central hall combined symbols that had never been united before. The bear of his adopted name intertwined with the serpent of the seer bloodline, the whole surrounded by runes that spoke of unity rather than hierarchy. The banner had been designed by his mother during the early days of their rebuilding efforts, when they were still discovering what it meant to live without the chains of enforced servitude or the weight of cosmic obligations they'd never agreed to accept. The ancient evil that had slept beneath the glaciers for centuries had indeed proved to be something far different from the destructive force their captors had claimed. When the mystical barriers finally collapsed, what emerged was not a monster hungry for destruction, but a consciousness that embodied the principle of uncontrolled growth and change. It had spent its imprisonment not plotting revenge, but learning to understand the mortal world that had developed during its absence. The integration continues more smoothly than we had dared to hope, Astrid said as she joined him on the hill. her voice carrying the contentment of someone who had finally found peace after decades of enforced servitude. The entity we freed has shown remarkable restraint in how it exercises its influence. Rather than imposing change through force, it has been teaching us to recognize opportunities for beneficial transformation that we might have missed. The months following their escape from the sanctuary had been filled with revelations that challenged everything Jorund thought he knew about the nature of power and responsibility. The cosmic authorities who had orchestrated his family's destruction were revealed to be entities from a realm where perfect order had eliminated all possibility of growth, change, or individual choice. They viewed the mortal world as a chaotic aberration that needed to be corrected through the imposition of rigid control systems. The seer bloodline had been targeted not because their abilities were dangerous, but because they represented the potential for mortals to develop supernatural capabilities without seeking permission from cosmic hierarchies. Every tradition the scattered families had maintained, every ritual they had performed to honor their ancestors, had been acts of rebellion against forces that demanded absolute submission to predetermined patterns. "Your father would be proud of what you've accomplished," Astrid continued, placing her hand on the arm that bore the silver ring marking his legitimate heritage. "Not just the rescue, though that was remarkable enough, but the way you've helped us all learn to live with freedom we'd forgotten how to use." The new settlement operated according to principles that balanced individual autonomy with collective responsibility. Decisions affecting the community were made through consensus rather than decree, and the supernatural abilities that had once marked their bloodline for persecution were now used openly to benefit everyone who chose to join their growing alliance. The mystical barriers that had once contained the ancient consciousness now served as teaching tools, helping people learn to work with forces of change rather than against them. Jorund's own transformation had been perhaps the most dramatic of all. The wandering warrior who had discovered an ancient chest in an abandoned village had become a leader who helped others navigate the complex relationship between individual desire and communal need. His supernatural abilities, no longer suppressed by ignorance or fear, had developed into capabilities that allowed him to perceive patterns of connection, linking all living things. "The ravens brought news this morning," Astrid said, pointing toward the sky where the blackbirds circled in patterns that conveyed meaning to those who knew how to interpret their flight. 3 more communities have expressed interest in joining our alliance. Word is spreading that there are alternatives to the old ways of organizing society. The growth of their movement had not gone unnoticed by the cosmic authorities who preferred mortals to remain divided and manageable. Agents working for the hierarchical powers had attempted to infiltrate the settlement, to sow discord and mistrust that would fracture the unity they'd worked so hard to build. But the ancient consciousness that now shared their world had taught them to recognize the signatures of imposed conflict, allowing them to identify and neutralize such threats before they could take root. "Do you ever regret the choice you made?" Astrid asked, her voice carrying the gentle concern of a mother who understood the weight her son had accepted when he chose freedom over safety. Jorund considered the question while watching children play in the settlement below, their laughter carrying on air that seemed somehow cleaner and more vital than what he remembered from his years of solitary wandering. These children would grow up knowing their heritage, understanding their capabilities, and choosing their own relationships with the supernatural forces that flowed through the world. They would never experience the crushing loneliness of believing themselves abandoned by family and destiny. "Every choice carries losses," he replied, using words that had become something of a personal philosophy during the months of rebuilding. "But regret implies wishing for a different outcome. And I can't imagine wanting a world where you remained imprisoned and our people continued to live in scattered fear." The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in colors that seemed to celebrate the day's accomplishments while promising new possibilities with tomorrow's dawn. In the growing twilight, Jorund could see the lights of other settlements beginning to appear in the distance, communities that had chosen to adopt the principles of balanced freedom rather than continue accepting the limitations imposed by cosmic authorities who claimed to know what was best for everyone. The story that had begun with a giant Viking finding an abandoned chest had become something far larger than personal reunion or family restoration. It had become a testament to the possibility that even the most entrenched systems of control could be challenged and transformed when people learned to trust their own judgment over the dictates of distant powers. As darkness settled over the valley and the first stars appeared overhead, Jorund felt the presence of his ancestors, not as commanding voices demanding obedience to ancient obligations, but as supportive spirits celebrating the courage required to write new chapters in stories that had seemed destined to end in tragedy. The chest that had changed everything still rested in a place of honor within the settlement's central hall, but it was no longer a repository of lost possibilities. Instead, it had become a symbol of the truth that even the most carefully constructed lies could be overcome by those brave enough to seek authentic understanding of their place in the vast web of existence that connected all living things.